Well, hello everybody. This week I'm so excited. We are starting a new sermon series. We are starting a series on the parables of Jesus. Now, if you are unfamiliar with what a parable is, or maybe you've simply forgotten, a parable is a story that's used to teach a deeper truth. Now, sometimes these parables can be really long and intricate, like the parable of the prodigal son, or they can be really, really short and simple, like the parable of the treasure in the field, which is only one verse long. During his ministry, Jesus used these stories with intent all the time to teach deeper truths about the kingdom of God, or about the character of God, or about how we all are supposed to relate to one another. This form of teaching is particularly compelling because it is both so accessible to all sorts of people, because everybody loves stories, right? But because these stories also encourage a response from a hearer more than any lecture ever could. They awaken our insight, and they prod our consciences, and they move us to action, really. So this week, we are going to dive into the parables, and we are going to look at a parable about grace and responsibility. There are two that kind of fall into this category. The other one being the parable of the unforgiving servant, found in Matthew 18, that we went over actually a few weeks ago. This week's parable is called the parable of the two debtors. Now, if you haven't had a chance to read it, or the kind of surrounding story around it, I'm going to have you go ahead and pause this video and read it right now. It's found in Luke chapter 7, verses 36 through 50. So go ahead and do that right now. Okay, so I'm assuming everybody's up to snuff and has read this story recently now. Okay, so as we have mentioned before, understanding the context of a story and the text is absolutely crucial to understanding Scripture, and this parable is absolutely no different. This particular parable is set within the narrative of a dinner party. Now, Jesus has been invited to eat a meal at the house of a Pharisee. Elsewhere in the Gospels, the Pharisees, they kind of fall into a particular role, right? They play the role of the foil, or almost like a villains a lot of the time. They embody the religious elite that don't understand Jesus, and they don't understand Jesus's ministry, and who tend to, really miss the point in spectacular fashion over and over again. But in this narrative, that's not quite what's happening. You will note the difference here because the Pharisee is actually given a name this time, Simon. He is given a name, and by giving him a name, the author, Luke, is intentional to present Simon as a real live human being who's actually interested by Jesus and is open to hearing his teachings. So Simon invites Jesus over to a meal at his house. Jesus accepts this offer, and he shows up at the appropriate time. So now, either arriving right before Jesus or just at the same time as Jesus, is a woman from the community that has a bit of a reputation. We aren't really even told her name, just that she's a woman who has lived a sinful life. Now, this term very likely means that she's a prostitute, but that's not the only interpretation of those words here. With our modern understanding of a dinner party, though, her appearance is kind of confusing, right? I mean, it would be weird to just have random people show up at a dinner party. It doesn't make sense. But in that day and in that context, these meals were far less private affairs, and it wouldn't be actually all that uncommon to have people from throughout the community to come uninvited and just kind of sit around the edge of the room with the servants and listen in to the conversation. What is perplexing, though, is that this woman, with her bad reputation, that she would come because she would have been considered ritually unclean, and therefore would have been an unwelcome entity in the home of a Pharisee. The text says that Jesus was reclining at the table, which in modern minds evokes an image of him like reclining at a table, right? But at these dinner parties, they didn't sit like upright like we do, and they didn't have these big tall tables like we normally sit at. They actually sat at very low tables where they would actually be almost laying down already, with their heads towards the food and their feet out towards the edge of the meal configuration. So, with Jesus's feet kind of right there in front of her, this woman begins to weep. And she begins to wet his feet with her tears. She wipes them with her hair. She kisses his feet. And then, while indicating that she had planned at least some level of this display, she whips out this alabaster jar of expensive perfume and proceeds to anoint Jesus's feet with the perfume. Now, really, such an act would really be out of the norm at any day, her act was truly spectacular and kind of extraordinary, since no respectable woman of that day would ever go out in public with their hair down. This would be a no-no. This whole scene would actually, very easily could have been interpreted as erotic if it wouldn't have been for her tears. I mean, she was crying the whole time. So, next, our narrator, Luke. He cuts to the inner dialogue of Simon, where Simon, is watching this scene unfold, and he scoffs in his head and thinks, well, if Jesus were really a prophet, kind of like he had heard, he would know this woman's reputation, and he would put a stop to this whole thing. This whole thing he wouldn't allow. Ritual purity was a primary concern to the Jews of Jesus's day, and this woman's presence, it very likely contaminated everybody there. No righteous person, and certainly no prophet, would ever tolerate this. There's no way that they would tolerate this, right? Then, in a bold move that totally fits with Jesus's character, Jesus responds out loud to what Simon was thinking in his head and proceeds to tell Simon this parable about the two debtors. It's really short, so I'm just going to go ahead and read it to you all right now. Starting in verse 41 of chapter 7. Two people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now which of them will love him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You have judged correctly, Jesus said. So, after Simon admits that the one who has been forgiven for more will love more, Jesus then further illustrates his point by contrasting the receptions he received from this woman and the reception he received from Simon. Simon had done really very little to display his love to Jesus. He'd even actually skipped over the most basic demand for hospitality in the day by foregoing offering Jesus water to wash his feet when he entered Simon's house. He did not greet Jesus with a kiss. He did not anoint Jesus's head with oil. But this woman had gone above and beyond all these things, and she had been really truly extravagant in her displays of love to Jesus. Her great love demonstrates that she has been forgiven for her many sins. Jesus wraps up this point by saying, therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. He kind of leaves that phrase just hanging there. Whoever has been forgiven little loves little. Now, Simon could take this to mean, one of two things. He could take this to mean that he responds to Jesus with less love because his sins were fewer and therefore he had been forgiven less. That's one way. But I think it's just as likely that Simon would look at his actions and see really no sign of love extended to Jesus. He would then be forced to wrestle with the question of whether he had actually been forgiven at all, and if so, why did he seem to have no awareness of that forgiveness? So the central point of this parable for you, me, and Simon is twofold. First, God forgives freely. You'll notice in the parable, the debtors didn't do anything in particular to warrant the moneylender forgiving their debt. They simply couldn't repay the amount that they owed, so the moneylender just scratched it out of his books, right? God freely forgives. The second thing to note is the one forgiven more will love more. The more hopeless your debt is, the more joy and relief and love for the moneylender, you as the debtor, will feel. The more you're forgiven, the more you'll love. Now, this makes as much sense now as it did in Jesus' day, but for that, I'm going to have you do a little thought experiment, right? Okay, so first I want you to imagine what you feel toward a person who picks up the check at dinner when you've misplaced your wallet or like lost your purse or something. What do you feel in those moments? You feel relief. You feel gratitude. You feel general admiration and maybe even affection for the person who has stepped in and has helped you. Okay, so that's that one person. Now I want you to compare that what you were feeling there to what you might feel for a person that steps in and pays your rent or buys your groceries if you've been laid off, or for a person that pays your hospital bill if you have an unexpected accident. Even more, imagine if somebody stepped in and just paid off all your student loans or paid off your entire mortgage. What would you feel toward that person? A whole lot more than simple admiration, right? You would love them all the more. It makes sense. The one forgiven more will love more. The more that you are forgiven, the more you love. They flow back and forth together. So, if that's what the parable means, then what do we need to do with this parable and with this whole story? Well, first, you have to know that God forgives freely. You have to know what it teaches. Like the moneylender, God forgives, not because we do anything particularly special or because we deserve his forgiveness. He sees that our debt is more than we can repay, so he forgives. I mean, this is actually what he sent Jesus into the world to do. He sent Jesus to proclaim release to the captives. That's you and me. To proclaim freedom to all of us that are stuck in a cycle of sinful, selfish behavior and then trying to earn God's forgiveness. We kind of go round and round with that. He sent Jesus to break us free from that. And we need more than just kind of a surface knowledge that God forgives freely. We have to let that knowledge sink in deep, to really pervade every inch of our being. God forgives freely. Now, what prevents most of us from really knowing that God forgives freely? Well, for that, I find that we kind of fall into one of two camps. And actually, both camps kind of stem from us underestimating reality. What is really going on in the situation. So the first camp underestimates God's power and willingness to forgive. They think, my sin is far too great for God to scratch out. It's just too much. And God's willingness to forgive is just too small. God can't do it or won't do it, but God's willingness to forgive, much too small. They underestimate God's willingness to forgive. The second camp underestimates the magnitude of their own sin. They deny that sin is really even a problem in their lives. I'm a good person. Sure, I'm not perfect, but I try. I mean, even established Christians are kind of drawn into this camp. So much of our time is spent trying to check off all the boxes, right? I pay my taxes, I attend church, I tithe, I volunteer, I pray. I do all of the things. I spend all of my time focusing on these, and I never, ever attempt to address those strongholds of sin in my life. So this camp, they even lose sight of what those sins might be. I mean, if you've ever sat in a time of confession, maybe during like a communion liturgy or just any time of confession and struggled to come up with something to repent of, then you're probably in this camp. I've been in this camp. I get this. To truly know, though, that God forgives freely, you have to acknowledge that there's something in your life for him to forgive. And then you got to accept that it is God's desire to do so. Okay, so the second thing then to draw from this parable is that forgiveness should produce a response. So Klein Snodgrass, the guy that literally wrote the book on parables, Klein Snodgrass puts it like this: grace that does not bring forth a response is grace unknown. And the premise of that idea is that one forgiven more will love more. That whole premise of that one forgiven more will love more hinges on the idea that forgiveness, whether for a little or for a lot, always produces the response of love. In the absence of love, it can be assumed that you are not really aware that you have been forgiven. Now, this is what was going on with Simon, right? Simon didn't have that awareness of forgiveness, either because he didn't understand Jesus's message or because he assumed that, he had been following all the religious rules, therefore he didn't have anything that he needed to be forgiven of. Either way, it's apparent by his actions, by his lack of love, that he had not accepted the gift of forgiveness that Jesus came to offer. Okay, so now, what does this mean for you and me? How do we apply this in our real life? Well, first, most of us come to church or, participate in church online, I guess. Anyway, most of us participate in church to learn how to love God more. We come to be in community and to grow in our ability to live into what Jesus calls that greatest commandment, to love our God with all our hearts, all our souls, all our minds, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. We come to learn how to do that. If we are seeking to love God more, then we have to come to grips with just how much we have been forgiven. We have to allow ourselves to be fully aware of our sin. To take off the blinders that we put up to protect ourselves from the truth. All of us would really rather not acknowledge our sin. Because that's just not fun, right? To acknowledge all the ways that we are selfish, to acknowledge all the ways that we seek to wrestle control out of God's hand, to acknowledge the ways that we put our own wants or our own comfort or our own, even our feelings of safety above the needs of others. To wrestle with that is really heavy stuff. In light of this pandemic that we've been experiencing in the last few months, and in the events that we have watched unfold on the news in the last few weeks, these have unearthed some pretty dark things in our society. So much greed, so much selfishness, racism, injustice. But if we're really honest, this time has likely brought to the surface some of the dark things that are in each of us as well. All of us have aspects of ourselves that we hope will never come to light. Those ugly things, those dark parts that we try so hard to hide, those things that we feel are just way too big to ever be forgiven. By God, well, maybe God can forgive it, but I'm certain that the people around me couldn't. We all have those things. Maybe it's anger. Maybe it's greed. Maybe it's sexual sin or an addiction to pornography. Maybe it's racism or classism or sexism or any of the isms. Whatever it is, we all have that stuff. We are all broken. If we truly want to grow in our ability to love God, we have to grow in our ability to take that stuff and lay it at Jesus' feet and accept the grace, to accept the forgiveness that he offers. So today, I'm going to encourage you to take off your blinders, to step back and look at the full scale of your debt. Normally we try to avoid that. I totally get that. That's going to be kind of counterintuitive, but today I want you to look at all of it. I'm going to ask you to take that dark thing that you've been avoiding acknowledging, and give it a name. Now, if you are watching this video alone, I want you to be bold. I want you to be bold, and I want you to name it out loud, like loud into the room. I'm fairly certain your furniture won't judge you, and I'm also certain that God is eager to forgive. So name it out loud. Now, if you are watching this with others, okay, sorry, go ahead, and I want you to name that one clearly in your head. Give it a name. Confess your sin. Lay down your darkness. Release the burden of selfishness and envy, resentment and hate. Do it now. Do it right now. Seriously, do it right now. Press pause and give yourself a minute to confess right now. Okay, now friends, I want you to hear some really good news. Who is in a position to condemn you? Only Jesus. And see, Jesus died for us. He rose for us. He reigns for us. He prays for us. God freely forgives. That's the entire reason that Jesus came, was to extend that forgiveness to a broken world. I want you to take this as your promise. God freely forgives. Take it as a promise and live into it now. My challenge for you this week is to allow that knowledge of the grace, of the forgiveness you have received, and let it move you to action. Allow it to move you to love God more. And by extension, move you to love the world that God created more. Those people that are created in God's image that He has surrounded you with, to love them more. You have been forgiven for a great debt. Rejoice in that and love your God all the more. Blessings to you all.